Our golden retriever disappeared, and the sinister old neighbor whispered, "We are next." And when I learned the horrible truth about his past, I acted decisively and, my name is John Andrews. I'm 42 years old, married to my wonderful wife, Emily, and we have two incredible kids. Our 16-year-old son, Ethan, and our 11-year-old daughter, Lily. We live in the quiet suburbs of Rye, New York, in a house that I can only describe as our dream home. It's one of those big, white colonial-style houses with a sprawling lawn and a porch swing that sways gently in the breeze. I guess you could say we've got it all: a great family, a beautiful home, and even a golden retriever named Max, who's as much a part of the family as any of us. But no story is ever that simple, is it? As perfect as things may seem on the outside, there's always something lurking in the background, threatening to tear it all apart. For us, that something is right across the street. Old Mr. Clarence Worthington III. Clarence, or Old Man Worthington, as the kids in the neighborhood call him, lives in what could only be described as a mansion. His house is this massive stone structure that looks like it belongs to a different era, and to be honest, it does. The Worthingtons have lived in that house for generations. They come from old money, the kind that never seems to run out, no matter how much time passes. Clarence inherited the place when his parents died, and as far as anyone knows, he's the last of his line. No kids, no wife, just him, a servant named Gerald, and his personal cook, Marcus. The man's a relic of another time, and in a town like ours, that makes him stand out like a sore thumb. I've lived in Rye for most of my life, and even as a kid, Worthington's house was this looming, intimidating presence. My friends and I would dare each other to run up to the front door and knock on it, but no one ever had the guts. The place was always dark, the windows sealed tight, and if anyone ever did catch a glimpse of Clarence, he was usually standing by one of the windows, glaring out at the world like he had some kind of vendetta against it. When Emily and I bought our house a few years ago, I didn't think much of the old man across the street. I figured he was just some bitter, lonely guy who didn't like change. But over time, we began to notice a pattern. Every time we were outside, whether we were playing catch with Max, grilling on the patio, or just sitting on the porch, Clarence would be there, watching us from one of his windows. It was subtle at first, just a shadowy figure in the distance, but then it became more obvious. I'd look up from mowing the lawn, and there he'd be, staring at me like I'd personally offended him by existing. At first, we shrugged it off. Emily joked that he was probably just jealous of how much fun we were having. "He's lonely," she said. "He probably just misses having a family." But after a while, it started to feel less like an old man being wistful and more like something darker, something resentful. I could feel his eyes on me, on us, all the time. It was unsettling, but what could we do? It wasn't illegal to look out your window. The weirdest part, though, wasn't even Clarence's creepy surveillance. It was Max. Our dog is smart. Too smart sometimes. He's got this routine. Every morning, he waits until we're all busy with something. Me making coffee, Emily getting ready for work, the kids rushing out the door for school, and then he bolts out into the backyard. At first, we thought he was just doing his business out there, but one day, I followed him to see where he was going. Max trotted over to the far corner of the yard, where we have this little garden shed and an old gate that leads to the side alley between our house and Clarence's. I watched in disbelief as Max nosed the gate open and slipped through, heading straight for Clarence's house. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Our dog, our lovable, goofy golden retriever, was sneaking off to visit the man who spent his days glaring at us from behind his curtains. I didn't want to make a big deal of it at first. Maybe Max was just curious, or maybe Clarence was feeding him treats through the fence. But the more it happened, the more I realized that it wasn't just a random thing. Max was visiting Clarence's house every single day, like clockwork, and always when he thought we weren't looking. I didn't say anything to Emily at first. She loved Max, and I didn't want to worry her with something that seemed so ridiculous. But then one day, I caught Max coming back from Clarence's house with something in his mouth, a small, ornate box, the kind you'd expect to find in an antique store or a museum. I took it from him and opened it, finding nothing inside except for a folded piece of paper with a single word scrawled on it in messy, spidery handwriting. Soon, that's when I realized this wasn't just some harmless thing. Clarence wasn't just a grumpy old man. He was actively doing something, and Max was somehow involved. I confronted Emily about it, showed her the box and the note, and to my surprise, she didn't seem as shocked as I expected. "I've seen him watching us," she admitted, "but I didn't want to worry you. I thought it was just harmless. He's old, he's lonely. But this is something else." From that moment on, things escalated. Max kept going over to Clarence's house, and no matter what we did, locking the gate, keeping him inside, he'd always find a way to slip out. And every time he came back, he brought something with him. An old coin, a broken watch, a faded photograph. It was like Clarence was sending us a message, piece by piece. Then came the letters. At first, they were just slipped under our door. Short, vague notes accusing us of trespassing, of letting Max destroy his garden, of ruining the peace and quiet of the neighborhood. But soon, they became more aggressive. Clarence threatened to sue us, to get the city involved, to have us evicted if we didn't control that damn dog. The letters were always signed, C. Worthington 3, followed by this strange phrase, heir to the Dukes of Northumberland. I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded pretentious as hell. Things came to a head about a month ago. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying a beer after a long day at work, when I saw Clarence standing on his front steps, glaring at me as usual. But this time, he didn't just go back inside. He walked down the driveway, crossed the street, and marched right up to our front door. I stood up, ready to finally confront him, but before I could say a word, he shoved a thick manila envelope into my chest. "You've been warned," he said, his voice cold and raspy. "If you don't leave, I'll ruin you." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with the envelope in my hands. I opened it up later that night, and inside were pages and pages of legal documents. Clarence was suing us, claiming that Max had caused thousands of dollars in damage to his property, that we'd violated some obscure zoning law, that we were a public nuisance. He'd even attached photos of his garden, showing broken flower beds and torn-up shrubs, which he blamed on Max. That was the last straw. I wasn't going to let some bitter old man destroy our lives over something as ridiculous as a dog sneaking into his yard. But I also knew this wasn't just about Max anymore. Clarence had been watching us for years, and now he was determined to get rid of us, one way or another. I spent the next few days talking to lawyers, trying to figure out what our options were. We weren't going to let Clarence bully us into leaving our home, but the more I learned, the more I realized how deep his connections ran. This wasn't just some petty neighbor dispute. Clarence had power, influence, and money, and he wasn't afraid to use it. And that's when things started to get really strange. The day after Clarence Worthington slapped me with the lawsuit, things took a turn for the worse. I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned all night, my mind racing with questions about the old man across the street. What was he really after? Why was he so obsessed with us, with our family, with Max? And what was with the strange objects our dog kept bringing back from his house? It felt like there was something deeper going on, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at one of the objects Max had brought back, a tarnished old coin, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't just going to sit around and wait for Clarence to destroy us. I needed to understand what was going on. I needed answers. Max had brought back several strange items over the past few weeks. The ornate box with the note, an old pocket watch, a worn leather-bound book with no title, and now this coin. None of it made any sense. At first, I thought they were just random trinkets Clarence had lying around, but the more I looked at them, the more I realized they weren't just ordinary objects. They were old, really old. The coin in particular caught my attention. It was heavy, with strange symbols etched into it that I didn't recognize. It didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I decided to reach out to a local antiques expert, a man named Richard Barlow who ran a small shop in town. I brought the items to him one afternoon, hoping he could shed some light on their origins. Richard took one look at the coin and his eyes widened. "This is no ordinary coin," he said, running his fingers over the strange symbols. "It's ancient, likely from the 16th century. And these markings, they're not from any currency I've seen before. They're more like sigils." "Sigils?" I asked, not sure what that meant. Yes, symbols used in ancient rituals, often associated with protection, or in some cases, darker practices. That word sent a chill down my spine. Rituals? Darker practices? What had Max gotten into over at Clarence's house? Richard examined the other items as well. The pocket watch, he said, was from the early 19th century and appeared to have belonged to someone of considerable wealth. The leather-bound book, though its pages were too faded to read, seemed to be a journal, possibly kept by someone in the Worthington family generations ago. And the ornate box? He couldn't place its exact origin, but he was certain it was of significant value, likely crafted in the late 18th century. It's strange, Richard said, frowning. These items aren't just old, they're valuable. Collectors would pay a fortune for them. But what's even stranger is that they all seem to be connected in some way. These aren't just random antiques. They're part of something bigger. I left his shop that day with more questions than answers. Why was Max bringing these items to us? What connection did they have to Clarence? And more importantly, why did it feel like these objects were tied to something far more sinister? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even more than usual. It wasn't just Clarence's usual glare from his window. I felt like something else was lurking in the shadows, something older, darker. I tried to ignore it, but when I closed my eyes to sleep, I started having strange dreams, vivid dreams that felt more like memories than figments of my imagination. In the first dream, I saw the group of people standing in a circle in what looked like the grand hall of Clarence's house. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, robes even, and they were chanting something I couldn't understand. In the center of the circle was a large stone altar, and on it lay the same coin Max had brought me. The symbols on the coin glowed faintly as the chanting grew louder. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. It felt so real, like I had been there, watching some kind of ancient ritual unfold before my eyes. I shook it off as just a bad dream, but the next night, it happened again. This time, the dream was even more detailed. I saw the faces of the people in the circle, stern, serious faces, like they were performing something important, something dangerous. And standing at the head of the group, watching over the ritual, was a man who looked just like Clarence, only younger. That's when it hit me. These weren't just random dreams. These were memories, visions of the past, tied to the Worthington family. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the Worthingtons. I went to the local library, where I found a few old books and articles about the family. The Worthingtons had been in Rye for centuries, one of the founding families of the town. Their wealth came from shipping, but they were known for more than just their money. There were rumors, whispers really, about strange things happening at their estate. People disappearing, unexplained occurrences. And always, the Worthingtons remained silent, aloof, never offering any explanation. As I read more, I came across something that sent a shiver down my spine. According to one of the older records, the Worthington family had a long history of involvement in the occult. There were stories of ancient rituals, of secret societies, of deals made with forces beyond this world. The family had been shrouded in mystery for generations, and many of the locals avoided their estate altogether, believing it to be cursed. I didn't believe in curses, not really, but the more I read, the more I started to wonder if there was something to it. Especially when I came across a passage about a strange event that happened in the early 1900s. According to the article, several people had gone missing near the Worthington estate, including a family who had recently moved into the neighborhood. Their bodies were never found, and the case was eventually closed, but the locals believed the Worthingtons had something to do with it. The family that disappeared had a dog, a golden retriever. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made my skin crawl. Max wasn't just visiting Clarence's house out of curiosity. He was connected to it somehow, to the history of that place, to the dark secrets that had been buried there for centuries. And Clarence wasn't just some bitter old man. He was the last of his line, the keeper of those secrets, and for some reason, he had fixated on us. Over the next few days, the visions became more intense. Emily started having them too, and even Ethan and Lily mentioned strange dreams. We all saw the same things: rituals, dark figures, and always, the Worthington house at the center of it all. It was as if the past was bleeding into the present, pulling us into a story we didn't want to be a part of. I started noticing more strange occurrences around the house. Objects would move on their own. Lights would flicker. And Max, our lovable, friendly dog, began acting strangely. He'd sit by the window for hours, staring across the street at Clarence's house, his tail wagging slowly, almost as if he were waiting for something. Then, one evening, an old man approached me while I was out walking Max. He looked familiar, like I'd seen him around town before, but I couldn't place him. He stopped me and said, "That dog of yours. He's not the first golden retriever to take an interest in the Worthington estate. There was another one, many years ago. Same breed, same look in his eyes. He disappeared, along with his owners. They were never seen again." I didn't know what to say. The old man just nodded at me, as if he'd said all that needed to be said, and walked away, leaving me standing there with Max, a cold feeling creeping up my spine. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The visions, the strange objects, the history of the Worthington family. It was all connected, and I had the sinking feeling that we were in over our heads. Clarence was playing some kind of game, one that had been set in motion long before we ever moved to this neighborhood. And Max, our loyal, loving dog, was at the center of it all. The past was coming for us, and I didn't know how to stop it. The tension in our home reached a boiling point in the days following my conversation with the old man. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was horribly wrong, that we were being drawn into a web we didn't understand. The objects, the dreams, the strange history of the Worthington family. It was all starting to make sense in the worst way possible. Clarence wasn't just some angry old man trying to bully us out of the neighborhood. No, there was something much darker at play. I could feel it in the air, a suffocating presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It all started with the lights. One night, a few days after Max brought back that strange coin, Emily and I were sitting in the living room, trying to relax after a long day. The kids had already gone to bed, and for once, things were quiet. But then, out of nowhere, a faint glow caught my eye. I looked out the window and saw that Clarence's house was lit up like a beacon. Every window was glowing with an unnatural, almost bluish light that seemed to pulse and flicker. At first, I thought maybe it was just a power surge or some kind of strange electrical issue, but when I stepped outside to get a better look, I heard it. A low, rhythmic hum, almost like chanting, coming from inside the house. It was faint, but unmistakable, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep in my bones. Emily came out to join me, and I could tell she heard it too. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Let's go inside," she whispered, gripping my arm. "I don't like this." We went back inside, but the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about those lights, that sound. It wasn't natural. Nothing about it was. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences escalated. Every evening, as soon as the sun set, the lights in Clarence's house would flicker on, and the humming would start again. It got louder, more insistent, as if something was building up to a crescendo. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever Clarence was doing in that house, it wasn't just the actions of a bitter old man trying to scare us off. It was something else, something I didn't understand. And then, one morning, Max disappeared. It was the worst feeling I'd ever experienced. He had slipped out of the house again, as he always did, heading straight for Clarence's place. Only this time, he didn't come back. Hours passed, and the pit in my stomach grew heavier with each minute that ticked by. I searched the yard, the alley, the entire neighborhood, calling his name until my throat was raw. But there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Panic set in. Emily was frantic, and the kids were in tears. Max wasn't just our dog. He was part of our family. We couldn't lose him. I knew where he had gone. I knew who had him. I stormed across the street, pounded on Clarence's door, and demanded to know where my dog was. But when he opened the door, all he did was smile. A cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I haven't seen him," he said, his voice smooth and calm, as if nothing was wrong. "Perhaps he finally decided to leave, just like you should." I wanted to scream, to punch him in his smug face, but something about the way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to glint with a dark amusement, stopped me cold. It was as if he knew something I didn't, as if he was waiting for me to figure it out on my own. I went back home, empty-handed, but I didn't stop searching. I combed through the woods behind our house, checked every nook and cranny of the neighborhood, but there was no trace of Max. That night, things took a darker turn. I was pacing the living room, trying to figure out what to do next, when I heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, like the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I rushed to the hallway and froze. There, on the floor, were long, dark streaks, footprints, leading from the front door into the kitchen. The strange part? They weren't human. The prints were too large, too misshapen, almost like the paws of some massive creature, but distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. I followed the tracks into the kitchen, but they ended abruptly in front of the pantry door. The room was silent, the air thick with tension, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I opened the pantry door, half expecting to find Max hiding inside, but it was empty. And then, the lights flickered. Emily screamed from the living room, and I rushed back to find her and the kids huddled together on the couch, staring in horror at the walls. They were covered in symbols, strange, twisting symbols that I recognized immediately. They were the same ones that had been etched into the coin Max had brought back from Clarence's house. The same symbols that had haunted my dreams for weeks. They were everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. And they were glowing, faintly, just like the lights in Clarence's house. I tried to wipe them off, but it was no use. The symbols were burned into the paint, into the very foundation of our home, as if they had always been there, waiting to be revealed. Emily was shaking, and the kids were in tears. I had no idea how to explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. Clarence was behind it. He was using those symbols, those ancient rituals, to manipulate us, to drive us out of our home. The next morning, I found Lily in her room, drawing. Normally, this wouldn't have concerned me, but when I looked closer at the paper in front of her, my heart dropped. She was drawing the symbols, the same ones that had appeared on our walls, the same ones I'd seen in my dreams. "Where did you see these?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," she said, not looking up from her drawing. "They're just in my head." It was then that I realized Clarence wasn't just targeting me. He was targeting my entire family, using his dark magic or whatever it was to worm his way into our minds, into our very souls. The situation spiraled out of control from there. Objects in our home began to move on their own, furniture shifting in the middle of the night, doors slamming shut with no explanation. We started hearing strange whispers, disembodied voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And always, that strange humming sound, just like the one I'd heard coming from Clarence's house. We were being haunted, stalked by something we couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The air in our home was thick with dread, and I could see the toll it was taking on Emily and the kids. We were all on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next strange occurrence, the next sign that Clarence was tightening his grip on us. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I had another vision. This one was clearer than the others, more vivid. I saw Clarence, standing in a dark room, surrounded by candles. He was chanting, his hands raised above his head, and in front of him was an old, tattered book, the same book Max had brought back from his house. As I watched, I realized that this wasn't just some random dream. This was a memory, a glimpse into Clarence's past. I saw him as a younger man, performing rituals, summoning forces beyond his control. And then I saw something else, something darker. I saw his family, the Worthingtons, performing the same rituals for generations, passing down their knowledge of the occult like a twisted family heirloom. That's when it all clicked. Clarence wasn't just some rich old man. He was the last of a long line of practitioners, people who had used dark magic to gain power and wealth. The Worthington family had been cursed, bound to these rituals for centuries, and Clarence was determined to keep that legacy alive. But there was more. I realized that Clarence wasn't just angry at us for invading his space. He was jealous. Jealous of our family, our happiness. He had no one, no wife, no children, just his power, his dark magic, and his empty mansion. He wanted what we had, but he couldn't have it. And so, he decided to destroy us instead. The symbols, the objects, the strange occurrences, they were all part of his plan to drive us out, to break us apart. And now, with Max gone and my family falling apart at the seams, I could feel that plan was working. But I wasn't going to let him win. I didn't know how, but I was going to find a way to stop Clarence Worthington III. I was going to get Max back, and I was going to protect my family, no matter what it took. Because this was more than just a fight over property or some petty neighbor dispute. This was war. The night that everything came to a head, I knew we couldn't wait any longer. Our home had become a living nightmare. Strange symbols glowing on the walls, whispers in the dead of night, objects moving as if possessed. Emily couldn't sleep. The kids were terrified, and Max was still missing. I couldn't shake the feeling that Clarence had him, that the old man had finally taken things too far. I wasn't going to sit by and let Clarence tear us apart. Whatever dark power he held over us, whatever curse his family had lived under for centuries, it was time to confront him. And if it meant walking into his house, into the belly of the beast, then so be it. I waited until midnight, when the lights in Clarence's house flickered on again. The strange blue glow lit up every window, and that low, rhythmic hum echoed through the night air. Emily wanted to come with me, but I couldn't risk her or the kids getting hurt. This was something I had to do on my own. I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and headed across the street. Clarence's front door was unlocked, which didn't surprise me. It was almost as if he was expecting me. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and dust, and that faint humming sound seemed to be coming from deep within the house, vibrating through the walls. I moved carefully, keeping the flashlight low as I made my way through the grand, dimly lit hallway. The house was just as imposing on the inside as it was from the outside, massive, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling. But it wasn't the opulence that unnerved me. It was the strange feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I passed through room after room, each one filled with old furniture, heavy drapes, and portraits of long-dead Worthington ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved deeper into the house, their expressions grim and disapproving. At the end of the hallway, I found a door that looked different from the others, smaller, more inconspicuous, as if it had been intentionally hidden. I pushed it open and descended a narrow staircase that led to the basement. That's when the true nature of Clarence's house revealed itself. The basement wasn't just a basement. It was a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, far larger than the house above would suggest. The walls were lined with strange symbols, like the ones that had appeared in our home, and the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and candle wax. It was clear that this was where Clarence performed his rituals. I moved cautiously through the underground maze, following the sound of the humming, which grew louder with every step. Finally, I came to a large chamber, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was an altar, carved from stone, with intricate symbols etched into its surface. Around the altar were candles, arranged in a perfect circle, their flames flickering with an unnatural, bluish light. But it was what lay on the altar that chilled me to the bone. Max. He was lying there, completely still, his eyes closed. For a moment, I thought he was dead, but then I saw his chest rise and fall. He was breathing, but just barely. And standing over him, chanting softly in that same rhythmic hum, was Clarence. The old man looked different in the candlelight. His skin pale, almost translucent, his eyes hollow and sunken. He was holding a book, the same leather-bound book that Max had brought to our house weeks ago, and he was reading from it in a language I didn't understand. As he chanted, the symbols on the walls began to glow, and the air in the chamber seemed to thicken with a dark, oppressive energy. This was it. Clarence was performing some kind of ritual, and Max, our dog, our family's protector, was at the center of it. I couldn't let this happen. I stepped forward, but before I could reach the altar, something stopped me. A force, invisible but powerful, slammed into me, knocking me back. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight skittering across the floor. When I looked up, I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, rising from the walls like smoke. The spirits of the Worthington ancestors. They moved silently, surrounding Clarence as he continued his chant, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. These were the spirits he had been summoning, the forces that had kept him alive for so long, the dark power that had cursed his family for generations. And now, they were coming for us. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. The spirits were closing in, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke, and I knew that if I didn't do something, they would consume me and Max, with whatever dark magic Clarence had bound them to. But then, something incredible happened. Max opened his eyes. He lifted his head, slowly, and as his gaze met mine, I saw something in his eyes, something more than just the loyal, loving dog I had always known. There was a light in them, a deep, ancient light, as if he understood what was happening, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Max jumped off the altar with a strength I hadn't seen in him before, his body moving with a fluid grace that didn't belong to any ordinary dog. He ran straight toward me, and as he did, the spirits recoiled, as if they were afraid of him. That's when I understood. Max wasn't just a dog. He was something more, something ancient, something powerful. He had been sent to protect us, to guard our family from the darkness that had been haunting us. And now, he was ready to fulfill that role. Max stood between me and the spirits, his fur bristling, his teeth bared. The spirits hesitated, their forms flickering, as if they were unsure whether to advance or retreat. Clarence, still chanting, seemed oblivious to what was happening, his focus entirely on the book in his hands, on the ritual he was trying to complete. But Max wasn't going to let him. With a deep growl, Max lunged at Clarence, knocking the book out of his hands. The moment the book hit the floor, the candles around the altar flickered and went out, plunging the chamber into darkness. The symbols on the walls stopped glowing, and the oppressive energy that had filled the air began to dissipate. Clarence stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. Without the book, without the symbols, his power was gone. The spirits that had surrounded him began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The Worthington curse, the dark magic that had kept Clarence alive for so long, was broken. It was over. Clarence fell to his knees, his body trembling. He looked up at me, his face a mask of fear and desperation, but there was no more power in him. He was just an old man, broken and defeated. Max stood beside me, his tail wagging slowly, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But I knew better. I knelt down and hugged him, my heart pounding with relief and gratitude. We had won. The next morning, the town was different. The heavy, oppressive feeling that had hung over the neighborhood for so long was gone. Clarence's house stood dark and empty. He had vanished, without a trace, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. It was as if he had never existed. But I knew the truth. We returned to our home, relieved but changed. The strange symbols were gone from the walls, the whispers had stopped, and the air felt lighter, freer. But there was still a lingering sense of unease, as if the darkness that had plagued us hadn't entirely disappeared. Emily and I knew that although we had broken Clarence's curse, the forces we had faced weren't entirely gone. As for Max, he was back to his old self, or at least, that's what it seemed like. But every now and then, I'd catch him staring off into the distance, his ears perked up, his body tense, as if he was still watching, still guarding us. There was something different about him now, something that reminded me of that night in Clarence's house, when he had faced down the spirits and broken the curse. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew that Max was more than just a dog. He had been sent to protect us, and though the immediate danger was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still on guard, still watching for something lurking in the shadows. Life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after everything we had been through. Ethan and Lily seemed to bounce back quickly, though Lily still had moments where she would draw strange shapes and symbols, the same ones that had appeared in the Worthington house. She didn't seem to know why she was drawing them, and when I asked, she would just shrug and say, "They're just pictures." Emily and I tried not to dwell on it, but it was hard not to wonder if Clarence's influence lingered in some small way, like an echo of the past that refused to fully disappear. We had won the battle, but part of me wondered if we had only delayed whatever it was that had been stalking us. One evening, about a week after everything had settled down, I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. Max lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws, looking as relaxed as ever. But then he suddenly lifted his head, his ears twitching as if he heard something in the distance. I followed his gaze across the street to Clarence's house. It stood empty and dark, the windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. But for a brief moment, just as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement in one of the windows, a shadow passing through the house. Max growled softly, low and deep in his throat, his eyes locked on the house. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The house was empty. Clarence was gone. The curse had been broken. But the unease I felt in my gut wouldn't go away. I reached down and scratched behind Max's ears, and he relaxed, leaning into my hand. But his eyes never left the house. In the end, we never saw Clarence again. His house remained vacant, a dark relic of the past, and the town slowly moved on from the strange events that had taken place. But I knew, deep down, that the Worthington legacy, the curse, the dark rituals, the ancient forces, hadn't been fully erased. It lingered, like a shadow at the edge of our lives, always just out of sight. And though we were free for now, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Max would make sure we were safe, though. Whatever came next, whatever lay in the future, I knew one thing for certain. As long as Max was with us, we'd be ready for it. He wasn't just a dog. He was our guardian, our protector, and I had no doubt that if the darkness ever returned, Max would be there, watching, waiting, and ready to fight it off once again. Because in the end, family is worth fighting for. And Max, well, Max had proven that better than anyone. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.